The rain fell like shards of glass, stabbing through the edges of my black coat. Atlanta's cold drizzle soaked my hair and ran down my neck, but I barely felt it. The chill in my chest, the hollow ache left by my mother's absence, was far worse than the weather. At 32, I stood alone at the edge of an open grave, staring at the coffin being lowered slowly into the wet earth. I had arrived early, knowing my family would turn up late, as always. They were never on time for what truly mattered. Only here, alone, could I have a private moment with my mother. Only here could I let myself cry without an audience. Under my coat, I wore what looked like a shapeless, simple dress, black and unassuming. To anyone else, it might have seemed like thrift store fare, a potato sack for a funeral. To my family, I looked like a failure, as they had always called me. The cruelest irony? That dress cost $50,000. Not a typo. $50,000 of quiet power, a prototype from my unreleased Vuna collection. Rare wool, dyed black so deep it absorbed light itself. The dress was mine, made for me, unseen by the world. Until now. I didn't move as the sound of engines tore through the cemetery's silence. 3 black wagons appeared, tearing up the gravel with arrogant precision, the tires crushing puddles I wouldn't dare step in. I didn't need to look. My father was always about the entrance, the display, the spectacle. Desmond stepped out first, hair perfect despite the rain, Italian leather shoes gleaming despite the mud. "You idiot! Watch the puddles," he yelled at the driver. "These are custom. Do you know how much these cost?" I let him scream, let him care about shoes while his wife, my mother, lay 10 feet away. Desmond's priorities had never been subtle. Appearance over substance, always. Then Bianca emerged. My younger sister, golden child of our family, the star in every mirror and camera frame, sunglasses hiding her eyes even on a gray, rainy day. Her designer boots sank slightly into the mud, but she didn't care. Behind her, her makeup artist hovered like a human shield, touching her nose with powder every few steps. "Not too much, Matt," she hissed, voice shrill but controlled. "I need to look tragic but glowing. Blogs will eat this up." She didn't just walk past me. She collided with my shoulder deliberately, shoving me slightly into the wet grass. Her husband, Chad, loomed beside her like a silent bodyguard, holding a massive umbrella to protect her from the rain. I stood drenched. I didn't move. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me uncomfortable. Her gaze swept over me slowly. I felt it physically, like an X-ray stripping me bare. Then came the laugh, short, sharp, cruel. "Seriously, Zora? Look at you," she spat, eyes narrowing behind those golden frames. "That dress. This is a funeral, not a costume party for the homeless." I didn't answer. I didn't flinch. My silence, my stillness, was my weapon. Her perfume hit me next, overpowering, sweet, suffocating. "There are important people here today," she continued, her voice loud enough for the mourners nearby to hear. "Respect, poise, presentation." I let her speak. I let the world see her arrogance, her cruelty. Inside, I smiled just a little. They had no idea what they were standing on. The crowd of mourners began to whisper, not about grief, not about loss, about the clash between the cold, wet girl in the potato sack and the golden princess perfectly groomed for social optics. I could hear their thoughts: shock, confusion, awe. My father moved to fuss with Bianca's hair, adjusting her umbrella as if he were performing a ceremonial duty, ignoring the coffin entirely. Chad hovered, controlling space like a general protecting his queen. And Bianca? She continued her performance, sneering subtly, trying to provoke me, failing spectacularly. I finally stepped forward, wet hem of my dress sticking to my legs, and looked straight at them. Every insult, every smirk, every condescending glance bounced off me like bullets off armor. They thought they had power. They thought they were in control. They had no idea. Years of mockery, of being called the family failure, of whispered jokes at my expense, of being left out of inheritance conversations, of being underestimated in every possible way. All of it culminated here, in the rain, at the funeral of the woman who had quietly believed in me. I let the storm rage, let the tears mix with rain, and waited. They would leave thinking they had won. That was fine. Let them think they were the masters of life and death. They didn't know the quiet one always writes the final chapter. And this? This was only the beginning. The rain had stopped by the time I left the cemetery, but the cold clung to my skin like a second layer. The mud had seeped into my shoes, the black hem of my dress heavy with water, but I barely noticed. I didn't need warmth, didn't need comfort. I had spent 32 years training myself for moments like this, alone, underestimated, and secretly unstoppable. People who never believed in me would always think I was weak, poor, and insignificant. My family, especially Bianca, had perfected this illusion. They had laughed when I took jobs that didn't pay much, called me the failure, and insisted I would never amount to anything. And yet, while they were busy performing for the world, I had been building my empire in silence. I pulled my coat tighter, remembering the years of quiet humiliation. The parties I wasn't invited to. The vacations I couldn't afford while they flaunted theirs. The nights I cried alone in my tiny apartment while they mocked me on the family group chat. It had been unbearable, yes, but it had also been my education. Every insult, every dismissal, every smirk became fuel. I learned patience. I learned strategy. I learned the art of appearing powerless while quietly acquiring everything I needed to destroy the illusion of power they clung to. By 25, I had founded Vuna, a fashion brand that would one day dominate the market. The same golden threads that Bianca wore in campaigns, the designer shoes she flaunted on Instagram, funded by me. Every paycheck she smiled at without knowing its origin was a tiny victory that I kept to myself. Bianca was blind to it. My father, obsessed with appearances, never bothered to ask where our wealth really came from. And my mother, the only one who had quietly supported me, had always smiled knowingly when I faced humiliation. She had whispered in my ear once, in a moment that now seemed like prophecy, "Zora, they will never see you coming. Build quietly, and one day they will kneel without even knowing why." And build I did. I expanded Vuna into a private empire, exclusive, untouchable, beyond the reach of the petty rivalries my family cherished. The prototypes Bianca wore at her photo shoots? Mine. The fabric she draped over her perfect body? My invention. The press releases she posted? Written and funded by me, though she thought she was the star. When I returned home after my mother's funeral, my apartment smelled of cedar and cashmere. Every piece of furniture, every garment, every luxury item screamed silent dominance. It was the reward of patience, strategy, and relentless drive. And soon, very soon, my family would realize it too. They had already begun to crumble without knowing it. The termination letters removing Bianca from all Vuna contracts were signed, sealed, and ready. Desmond's precious investments that he thought were untouchable were subtly redirected under my management. Chad, her smug husband, had unknowingly relied on me for every sponsor deal, every connection, every contract. He had been dancing in my hands the whole time, completely blind. I remembered the funeral again, my sister's laugh cutting through the rain like glass. I had stayed calm. I had let her mock me. I had let her think she had power, and now I could see the future clearly, laid out in my mind like a chessboard. Every move they had made, every arrogance-fueled step, would lead to their downfall. I was just waiting for the right moment to execute it. The house was empty when I arrived. My mother's possessions had been packed neatly into boxes by a professional team I had hired weeks in advance. I wandered through the living room, touching a photograph of my mother holding me as a child. Her eyes had always been the only ones that saw me clearly. She had died believing in me. Now it was my turn to make sure her belief had meaning. I poured a glass of wine and sank into the velvet chair by the window, staring at the city skyline. Atlanta glowed under the twilight, indifferent to human suffering, yet everything felt electric with possibility. I thought about my father who had yelled at a puddle while my mother lay in the ground. I thought about Bianca, preening for invisible cameras, not realizing her empire was built on my labor. I smiled faintly. They had spent years underestimating me. They had spent decades mocking me. And all of that energy, that arrogance, had been stored, collected, and converted into power. Quiet power. My kind of power. By the next morning, my plan would begin. The first dominoes would fall. Contracts would be canceled. Social media accounts restricted. Bank accounts frozen. The golden child would find herself powerless in a world she thought she owned. Desmond would see that money, status, and appearance were meaningless when wielded by someone invisible. And I would watch it all unfold, not in a boardroom, not in a courtroom, but in the quiet dominance of a woman who had always been underestimated. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through the list of people who depended on me, sometimes unknowingly, and typed out the first emails of the day. Precision, timing, and strategy. The emails were polite, almost casual, but behind them lay the full force of my control. Contracts terminated, sponsors pulled, payments redirected, social media campaigns canceled, all silently, all without warning. I could almost hear Bianca screaming in my imagination. I could almost hear Desmond's rage echoing through the halls. But that was for tomorrow. Tonight, I allowed myself one indulgence, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that power, real power, had been mine all along. Years of being mocked, ridiculed, and ignored had led me here. And soon, very soon, they would understand what it meant to be powerless, in the hands of the one they never noticed. For the first time in years, I felt warmth, not from the clothes, not from the wine, but from the knowledge that the world had underestimated me. And they would regret it, every single one of them. This was the moment when the black sheep, the one they called a failure, became the storm. And storms, as everyone soon learns, do not apologize. The morning after the funeral, the air in Atlanta seemed unusually sharp. It wasn't just the chill of the city, but the subtle tension of power about to shift. I woke early, black coffee in hand, watching the sun cut through the fog. The world outside was oblivious, unaware of the storm about to hit Bianca. She still thought she was untouchable. She thought her contracts, her social media fame, and her network of influential friends were permanent fixtures. She had no idea that every thread of her so-called golden life was delicately stitched with my hands, every foundation laid by the sister she had mocked endlessly. I started with small things. Emails sent to Vuna's legal team, quietly ensuring that Bianca's exclusivity contracts were voided due to breaches she had long ignored. Her social media manager received a polite, due to restructuring, all campaigns under your management will be paused. Gentle words, nothing suspicious, but the ripple effect was immediate. By noon, subtle panic had begun to set in. Bianca's Instagram, usually filled with perfectly curated posts, showed a strange error. Posts delayed, engagement plummeting, sponsorships paused. She couldn't comprehend what was happening. Chad was pacing, phone in hand, eyes darting between Bianca and the team, demanding explanations, but all they could do was give her rehearsed apologies. Meanwhile, I stayed in my apartment, calm as always. I sipped another cup of coffee, scrolling through analytics. Every disruption, every delay, was mine to orchestrate. They had laughed at me, mocked my potato sack, called me a failure in front of the world. And now, the golden child, the perfect sister, the Instagram star, the queen of appearances, was beginning to crumble. The first email arrived from Bianca herself, sharp and demanding. "Zora, what is going on? Why are my campaigns paused? Who authorized this? Fix this immediately." I smiled. I didn't respond. Not yet. Timing, precision, and control. That was my weapon. By the afternoon, news outlets began reporting unusual activity. Rumors spread. A major model's campaigns had been suspended unexpectedly. Bloggers speculated, fans panicked, and the social media bubble that Bianca had lived in her entire adult life started to crack. And she had no idea that her downfall had been orchestrated by the sister she had called a failure in front of our mother's grave. I knew the family would notice soon. Desmond would demand answers. Chad would panic. And Bianca, she would unravel, piece by piece, in ways I could predict with terrifying accuracy. By evening, I orchestrated the next move. A phone call to a high-profile sponsor, delivered with casual politeness, ended in immediate contract termination. Their reason? Breach of agreement, undisclosed violations, and misrepresentation. Bianca's name would no longer be associated with them. The network she had thought untouchable crumbled silently, invisibly, all under my control. She didn't understand because she had never looked beyond herself. She had mocked me, ignored me, treated me like an obstacle at worst, and invisible at best. But I had watched, learned, and waited. And now she was beginning to feel the full weight of what it meant to underestimate the quiet one. Later that night, I allowed myself to imagine her reaction. She would stare at her phone, eyes wide, panic rising. Chad would lecture her in private, but their combined arrogance meant they would never consider that I was behind it. She would blame everyone else, lawyers, managers, sponsors, but never me. And that, of course, made it far more satisfying. I leaned back in my chair, taking it all in. The golden child, the perfect model, the rising star. She was collapsing under the weight of systems she didn't understand, all because the sister she had humiliated had built an empire in silence. Then came the subtle public humiliation. I arranged a press release highlighting the importance of contractual compliance and brand integrity, mentioning Bianca's account suspension in passing. Bloggers caught wind of it, sharing screenshots with sharp commentary. The first cracks in her carefully maintained persona began to appear online. Fans noticed the sudden disappearance of campaigns and posts. Brands questioned their partnerships. Bianca's phone blew up with panicked texts from managers, sponsors, and even her PR team. Chad hovered over her constantly, trying to protect her image, but nothing he did could stop the dominoes I had set in motion. He didn't know that every move he made, every frantic phone call, every desperate attempt to regain control, was anticipated. He was trapped in my invisible web, just like Bianca. Meanwhile, I remained calm. I watched the city lights through the rain-streaked windows of my apartment. My empire was invisible, untouchable. I didn't need to yell, I didn't need to confront. I only needed to pull the right levers at the right time. And my family would never know who did it until it was too late. By the end of the day, the fall of the golden child was no longer a possibility. It was a fact. Bianca's social media engagement dropped by 40%. 2 major sponsors withdrew, citing contract violations. Chad's investments tied to her influence were frozen. And Desmond, my father, began to notice that the empire he had thought untouchable was slipping from his grasp. But he didn't yet understand who had the real power. I allowed myself a small, private victory, the kind that doesn't need applause, because those who deserve it were powerless to see it. And just before I went to bed, I sent the final email of the day. A simple message to Vuna's legal team. Terminate all Bianca's brand affiliations immediately. No exceptions. No delays. Tomorrow, the final wave would begin. The storm I had been building for decades was gathering momentum, and it would hit the family with full force. They had mocked me, humiliated me, dismissed me. And now, in the silence I had built, the black sheep, the sister they thought broke, powerless, invisible, would rise. By the time they understood, there would be nothing left to save. The golden child was falling, and I was the wind that brought her down. The next morning, the tension in my apartment was almost tangible. Not mine, my calm was absolute, but the world outside was already shaking. Bianca didn't know it yet, but her carefully curated life was beginning to crumble. I checked my phone casually. Notifications piled up. Emails, calls, messages from brands, influencers, lawyers, and managers. The golden child's empire was unraveling quietly, invisibly, and no one suspected my involvement. Each alert was a victory, a confirmation that meticulous planning had worked flawlessly. By mid-morning, the first cracks were visible to the outside world. Blogs and news outlets had picked up on the sudden suspension of Bianca's campaigns. Fans tweeted questions, expressing confusion over why their favorite influencer had disappeared overnight. Sponsors issued statements citing contract irregularities and compliance issues. Bianca's social media, usually flooded with likes and flawless commentary, was suddenly silent. Chad called repeatedly, his voice tight with anxiety. He demanded explanations, blamed managers, lawyers, everyone. But never me. He didn't know who orchestrated this invisible collapse. I let him fume. The irony of the situation was exquisite. Desmond, of course, didn't understand either. He called me, his voice a mix of panic and indignation. "Zora, something is happening with Bianca's contracts. What did you do?" I allowed a small smile to form. Calm, collected, I replied, "I haven't done anything, Father. Perhaps it's just mismanagement. You should ask her lawyers." There was a pause. Then the familiar voice of arrogance and control cracked slightly, because for once, Desmond didn't know the answer. I could hear the subtle tremor in his tone. That tremor was delicious. By noon, I decided it was time for a direct move. I arranged a private meeting at Vuna headquarters, inviting Bianca, Chad, and a few of the family's closest associates who thought they were untouchable. The location was casual, yet secure. Every step, every detail was mine to control. When they arrived, the moment they stepped into the office, the atmosphere shifted. Bianca's expression faltered when she saw me at the head of the room. Chad stiffened. Desmond's eyes widened slightly. "Welcome," I said calmly, gesturing toward the seats. "Please, have a seat." The room was silent, their tension palpable. They did not know it yet, but the game had changed. I began with a brief overview of Vuna's recent operations, speaking in tones of neutrality, the way a CEO speaks to a board. Then I paused deliberately, before letting the next words fall. "Bianca, Chad, there are issues with your contracts. Certain clauses have been violated, and after consulting with our legal team, I've had no choice but to terminate your brand affiliations immediately, effective today." Chad opened his mouth and Desmond sputtered, but Bianca froze. Golden child, used to control, used to praise, used to influence, was powerless. "You... what?" Bianca's voice trembled, though she tried to mask it with a sharp, commanding tone. "You can't do this. I have sponsors. I have campaigns." I leaned forward slightly, eyes calm, and said, "All of them are now under new management. Any violations you believe exist are real. Your contracts, your sponsorships, everything you built here is contingent on compliance. Compliance you failed to meet." Desmond finally spoke, his voice a mix of outrage and disbelief. "Zora, what is this? You're our daughter. How can you... How can I?" I interrupted softly, letting the words land like heavy stones. "How can I what? Protect my business? Ensure my brand survives? Make sure the empire I built in silence isn't destroyed by arrogance and carelessness?" "Exactly." Bianca stood, her hands shaking. She attempted to storm out, but I cut her off gently, deliberately. You will want to stay, I said. It's important to see how the world works when you've relied on someone else to prop you up for too long. Her face flushed red. Chad opened his mouth, but I didn't allow him to speak either. Silence is a weapon far sharper than words, and I wielded it with precision. Over the next hour, I presented every violation, every oversight, every contract clause that had been ignored. I did it calmly, methodically, without emotion. The family tried to argue, to shout, to manipulate, but the evidence was absolute. Every sponsor, every campaign, every account they had believed unassailable was now gone. By the end of the meeting, the reality had set in. Bianca's empire, built on appearances, was shattered. Chad's protective bubble of arrogance had failed. Desmond's illusion of patriarchal control was gone. And I was the only one in the room who remained untouched, unshaken, untouchable. I leaned back in my chair, watching the family process the destruction I had orchestrated. You see, I said softly, the world does not bend to arrogance, entitlement, or ego. It responds to vision, diligence, and control. Bianca's eyes welled with tears, though she refused to let them fall. Chad looked like he might explode at any second. Desmond's jaw was tight. His pride had been broken in ways he hadn't experienced in decades. This was only the beginning. I let them stew in their humiliation. I let them watch their golden world collapse because the sister they mocked, the one they underestimated, had quietly taken control of everything they believed belonged to them. And then I left the office, leaving them in stunned silence. Later that night, I watched the city lights from my apartment, the same city that had seemed indifferent yesterday, now feeling electric with power. My mother had always said I would rise quietly while others danced in the spotlight. She was right. Bianca and Chad would scramble, Desmond would rage, but it wouldn't matter. I had already won. And soon the world would know that the quiet one, the black sheep, the invisible sister, was not only unbreakable, but unstoppable. By the time they realized the full extent of their failure, there would be nothing left to save. The empire I had built in silence had finally claimed its throne, and they were powerless to stop it. The morning after the confrontation, Atlanta seemed almost serene, as if the city itself had been holding its breath, waiting for the storm to pass. But the storm had not passed. It had only begun. Bianca and Chad were reeling. Desmond was simmering in quiet fury, and the rest of the family was scattered like pawns who had just realized the queen was untouchable. I walked through my apartment, barefoot on the dark oak floors, sunlight streaming through the wide windows. I had spent years building this life, silently, meticulously, one calculated step at a time. Every setback my family had thrown at me, every sneer, every insult, had been a brick in the foundation of the empire they never saw coming. The news came first. Bianca's public accounts had gone offline. The sponsors she depended on had pulled out, citing breaches, violations, and non-compliance. Her social media managers had fled, refusing to continue under the scrutiny of legal action. Her fan base reacted with confusion and outrage, unaware that the person they adored had been living atop a house of cards built on my labor. Chad tried to intervene, calling Vuna headquarters repeatedly. Every call went unanswered. The empire I had built didn't need me to answer phones. It ran itself, perfectly, silently, like a storm gathering before the final strike. Desmond called next. His voice was tight, shaking with disbelief. Zora, you can't. This is absurd. You're our daughter. You. I let him finish, the words tumbling uselessly into the void. Calmly, I replied, Father, it's not absurd, it's business. You've spent decades valuing appearances over substance, assuming power comes from shouting the loudest. It doesn't. Power comes from foresight, discipline, and control. Something I've had since the day you dismissed me. He was silent. I could hear the disbelief and the first threads of fear in his voice. He had always believed appearances were reality. Now reality was staring him in the face, and it wasn't what he had expected. The day progressed, and the ripple effect of my actions spread wider. Major fashion houses reached out to Vuna for collaboration, not to Bianca. Influencers and socialites whispered among themselves, shocked by the rapid fall of a once celebrated model. Every move Bianca and Chad made was met with obstacles I had pre-planned. Every ally they thought they had was carefully redirected to work with me instead. And then came the ultimate blow, the family inheritance. While they had been mocking me at funerals and underestimating me in business, I had quietly assumed control over investments, assets, and properties. Their expected dominance over the family fortune evaporated as I revealed that the legal documents, quietly updated weeks earlier, had placed me in sole authority. The confrontation was private but devastating. Desmond, usually so arrogant, pleaded. Bianca tried manipulation, tears, and charm. Chad offered excuses and promises of compliance. I listened politely, then laid out the facts. Every asset, every property, every bank account was under my oversight. Every contract they had taken for granted had been legally redirected. Every public appearance and sponsorship had been carefully curated by me to ensure their collapse if they ever disrespected me. The room fell silent. Even their arrogance could not mask the shock. "You see," I said softly, my voice calm but steel sharp. "All of you treated me as a shadow, someone invisible. I was patient. I built quietly while you flaunted privilege and mocked me. And now," I paused, letting the weight of those words sink in. "You are powerless." Bianca's lips trembled, Chad's hands clenched, and Desmond's posture sagged. The golden child had lost her empire. The proud husband had lost control. The father had lost his illusion of patriarchal dominance. And the sister they dismissed, the one they called a failure, had risen to claim everything. From that day forward, the world saw me differently. Vuna expanded, collaborations multiplied, and my empire became a household name, built in silence, solid, unstoppable. The family had no choice but to watch as their illusions were stripped away. No screams, no arguments, no protests could undo the precise orchestration of decades of planning. I walked through the headquarters, my reflection in the polished floors showing a woman transformed. Not the girl they had mocked at the funeral, not the shadow they had ignored at family gatherings. I was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar fashion empire, the architect of my family's reckoning, and the inheritor of my mother's quiet pride. Even Bianca eventually understood, though too late, that the paycheck she had once admired without question, the sponsorship she flaunted, the career she believed she had built on merit, had been mine all along. Chad realized that his influence was a mirage. Desmond's authority, his obsession with appearance and control, crumbled completely. And I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Power, real power, does not require noise. It speaks quietly, but it reverberates infinitely. By nightfall, I stood alone on the balcony of my penthouse. Atlanta spread beneath me like a glittering tapestry. Rain had returned, washing the city clean. It reminded me of the funeral, of standing alone at my mother's graveside, of the icy chill that had once seemed unbearable. Now it felt like triumph. I whispered, her name, my mother's, into the wind. "You were right, Mother. They never saw me coming." And then I turned away from the skyline, from the chaos I had orchestrated, and allowed myself a quiet, satisfied smile. The empire I had built in silence now belonged to me entirely. And the family who had mocked, humiliated, and underestimated me? They had no place in it. The storm had passed, but its aftermath would echo forever. I was no longer invisible. I was unstoppable, The black sheep had finally claimed her throne.